Zainab had once been a spirited young woman with dreams of teaching children and raising a family on her own terms. Her laughter filled the small clay-walled home in the village, where she lived with her aging parents. But life rarely lets dreams unfold as planned, especially in places where tradition speaks louder than a woman's voice. At just 17, Zainab's life took a sharp turn. A distant relative, 45 years old and wealthy, came with a proposal. Her father, crippled with debt and pride, agreed without asking Zainab. She was told, not asked, that she would marry this man. She cried, begged, and screamed, but her voice became a whisper against the clamor of male decisions. That week, she became someone's wife, not out of love, but obligation. Her tears were lost in the rhythm of drums and forced blessings. The man, Akram, was cruel beneath his polished exterior. He believed that buying Zainab entitled him to own her body, spirit, and soul. He was twice her age and had no interest in her dreams, only in producing a son. Nights were filled with fear, and days with silence. Her once vibrant eyes became hollow, carrying dark circles that seemed older than her years. After a year of torment, she gave birth to a boy, Yusuf. Yusuf was her only light. His tiny fingers grasped her hand as though anchoring her to life. She poured into him all the love she never received. She sang to him lullabies filled with sorrow and hope, telling him stories of freedom under her breath while breastfeeding him in a dim room. Yet even that bond was not hers to fully claim. Akram was possessive of the boy. He wanted a strong son molded in his own harsh image. As Yusuf grew, Zainab noticed a change in her child. His smile became guarded, and his eyes watched his father's mood before making a move. At just 4 years old, Yusuf had learned to fear. Akram began beating Yusuf for the smallest things, dropping food, playing too loudly, asking questions. Zainab tried to intervene, only to be slapped or locked in a room for days. The child cried for her from behind closed doors. "Ammi, please," he'd whisper. She'd claw at the walls, weeping. She wanted to run away, but she had nowhere to go. Her father had disowned her once she brought shame by complaining about her husband. The villagers turned a blind eye. A woman's pain, they said, is her test. And a child's tears? They dried too quickly for anyone to notice. Years passed and Zainab endured. Yusuf was 8 now, quiet, gentle, and strangely mature for his age. He had learned how to avoid Akram's rage, but it came at a cost. His childhood was fading. One evening, Zainab found bruises on his back. She asked what happened, and he said with flat eyes, "Abu says pain makes a man strong." That night, Zainab broke. She held Yusuf as he slept, and something inside her snapped, not in fear, but in resolve. She began planning, carefully and silently. She started selling embroidery in secret, saving every rupee in a hidden corner of their crumbling kitchen. It took nearly a year, but finally, she had enough to run to a shelter she'd once heard about from a woman at the well. She waited for Akram to leave for his cousin's wedding one morning. With trembling hands, she woke Yusuf, bundled him in a shawl, and they ran, barefoot, breathless, but free. The shelter took them in. For the first time in years, Zainab slept without fear. Yusuf began smiling again, not fully, not yet, but a smile nonetheless. Zainab found work as a kitchen helper, and Yusuf was enrolled in a small school. When the counselor at the shelter asked her what she wanted for her future, she said, "I want my son to believe the world is kind again. That's all." But even then, freedom came with chains. Akram filed a case in court, claiming she had kidnapped his son. She was dragged into legal battles, shamed again, questioned for her motherhood, her silence, her past. The court wanted proof of abuse, but pain leaves no paperwork, just scars. Yusuf was called to testify, and the little boy stood in court, facing the man who had broken his spirit. "I don't want to go back," he said simply. "He hurt me. He hurt Ammi." The judge ruled in her favor. For once, justice bowed to truth. Today, Zainab and Yusuf live in a rented room near the shelter. It's not much, a bed, a fan, 2 plates, but it's theirs. Every evening, Zainab lights a small candle and prays. Not for riches, not even for revenge, just for strength. And every morning, she braids Yusuf's hair, kisses his forehead, and tells him, "You are not what he tried to make you. You are light. You are love." Because even a mother forced into darkness can raise a child who finds the sun again. Years had passed since Zainab had escaped the shackles of her forced marriage with young Yusuf in her arms. Time hadn't healed all wounds, but it had softened some edges. Their rented room grew into a small apartment with cracked walls but warm light. Zainab worked 2 jobs now, cooking during the day at a school canteen and sewing clothes at night. Her back ached more often, her fingers bore small scars from the needle, but she never complained. Because each time Yusuf brought home a perfect score on a test or smiled with ease, she felt it was all worth it. Yusuf, now 16, was not like other boys his age. While others were loud and wild, Yusuf was quiet, observant, thoughtful. He didn't speak much about his early childhood, but the fear from those days still lingered beneath his calm surface. The nightmares still visited sometimes, waking him in a sweat, breathless, clutching the edge of the bed. Zainab would rush to his side and run her fingers through his hair until he calmed. "It's over," she'd whisper. "He can't touch you now." But life wasn't done testing them. One ordinary Tuesday, while Yusuf was at school, a man in a crisp white shalwar kameez came to Zainab's workplace. It was Akram's brother. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just smiled coldly and said, "You think you've won? Akram is out, and he's coming for his son." Zainab felt her heart collapse. Akram had been released early for good behavior, the court record said. It didn't matter that he was a monster behind closed doors. He had money, connections, and no shame. That night, Zainab didn't sleep. She sat at the window, holding the rusted iron bars like they were the only things keeping her safe. Her mind flashed with terrifying images. Yusuf being dragged back, courtrooms filled with men questioning her again, people asking, "But he's the father, right?" When she told Yusuf the next day, he didn't panic. He didn't cry. He just sat silently, then asked, "Will we run again?" Zainab shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "We won't run. Not this time." This time, they would fight differently. They approached a local NGO that helped abuse victims. A young female lawyer named Fariha took up their case. She was fierce, fearless, and for the first time, Zainab didn't feel alone. Fariha helped them file for a protection order and even pushed for charges of child abuse and domestic violence against Akram, using old medical records and witness testimonies from the shelter staff. But the legal system was slow and heavily biased. Akram was already working behind the scenes, offering bribes, manipulating paperwork, and trying to paint Zainab as an unfit mother. It all came down to one final hearing. Yusuf, now older and stronger, stood again before the court. This time, he didn't just whisper. He stood tall and looked the judge in the eye. "When I was a boy," he said, "I didn't know what a father was supposed to be. I thought fear was love. I thought pain was normal. My mother showed me what love really is. She worked night and day to keep me safe. She gave up everything so I could sleep peacefully. If you send me back to that man, you're telling every child like me that fear wins. That abuse wins. And I won't accept that. Not anymore." There was silence in the courtroom. Even the judge's expression shifted. That day, Zainab was granted full, permanent custody. Akram was barred from contact indefinitely. But more importantly, Yusuf had found his voice. And he used it not just for himself, but for his mother. After the trial, Zainab wept, not because she was sad, but because for the first time in her life, someone had stood for her. Her son, the boy she'd once carried through the night, barefoot and desperate, was now her protector, her strength. Years later, Yusuf would go on to study law. He wanted to fight for others like his mother, women silenced, children forgotten. He carried her story in his heart like a torch. Zainab, older now, with gray in her hair and peace in her smile, finally opened a small stitching center for widows and abused women. Their story became one of survival, yes, but more than that, it became a story of resistance, of love that did not break, even when beaten, of a mother forced, but never defeated, and of a child once innocent, now unbreakable. Because in a world where some people live to harm, others, like Zainab and Yusuf, live to heal. Yusuf was 27 now, sharp-suited, soft-spoken, and feared in courtrooms across Lahore. His name had begun circulating quietly among legal circles, not just because he was young, but because he had a reputation. He took the cases no one else dared to. The forgotten women, the invisible children, the abused, the silenced, the broken. People whispered that he was fueled by something deeper than ambition, and they were right. Every case he took was a way of protecting his mother over and over again. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled over the city, he received a call from Fariha, the same lawyer who had once fought for Zainab. She was now heading a legal aid clinic. "Yusuf," she said, her voice tight, "I have a case. It's sensitive. Might be too much. But I think it's meant for you." A week later, Yusuf sat across from a terrified little girl, barely 10, clutching a threadbare teddy bear and staring at the floor. Her name was Mina. Her mother, Shazia, had recently fled an influential landlord from a rural village after suffering years of abuse. Shazia had been married off at 15 and bore 3 children, but Mina was the only one who had survived. The others, she whispered, had died from beatings. No one investigated. Now, the landlord was suing for custody of Mina, claiming paternal rights and threatening to destroy Shazia if she didn't return. The man had wealth, power, and dozens of politicians in his pocket. Shazia had nothing but a trembling child and a shelter bed. But she also had Yusuf. As Yusuf listened, he kept glancing at Mina, her small, bruised hands, her darting eyes, her silence. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. He saw himself in her, the same fear, the same confusion. And he saw his mother in Shazia, thin, sleepless, and broken-hearted, but still standing. "I'll take your case," Yusuf said, "and I promise you he won't touch her again." The trial was brutal. The landlord arrived in court surrounded by bodyguards, laughing, confident. His lawyers twisted the story, accusing Shazia of being mentally unstable, of poisoning the child against her father. They waived documents, spoke of tradition, of family honor. They even tried to discredit Yusuf, calling him an emotional crusader, not a real lawyer. Yusuf, however, remained calm. He spent weeks collecting witness statements, neighbors from the village who had fled too, medical records, shelter reports. He found the village teacher, who confirmed Mina had shown up at school with bruises too many times. He called social workers, trauma therapists, and even brought in a psychologist to testify about Mina's deep, paralyzing fear. Then he did something bold. He asked the judge to let Mina speak privately, just her, the judge, and Yusuf. The room was silent as the request was granted. In that quiet chamber, Mina sat frozen. Yusuf knelt before her, just like his mother had once done for him. "You don't have to be brave," he whispered. "You just have to tell the truth. That's all." Mina blinked back tears. "Will he take me away?" she asked. "Not if I can help it," Yusuf replied, his voice cracking for the first time in years. That day, Mina spoke. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. She spoke of nights when her father would beat her mother until blood stained the floor, of times she was made to watch, of how he'd hold her by the hair and scream that girls were worthless. She described hiding under the bed for hours, holding her breath until morning came. The judge didn't say much that day, but Yusuf saw it in her eyes. Something had shifted. 2 days later, the verdict came. The landlord lost custody. Shazia was granted full guardianship, and a restraining order was placed on the man who once believed his power made him untouchable. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed Yusuf. He waved them off. Instead, he knelt beside Mina and handed her a small silver pendant. "My mother gave this to me," he said. "It reminded me that I was never alone. Now it's yours." Mina smiled for the first time. That evening, Yusuf visited Zainab. She had grown older, her hair streaked with white, her hands still busy with sewing. She poured him chai, and he sat on the floor like he always had. Quietly, he told her the story of Mina, of Shazia, of the trial. Zainab listened with wet eyes. "You saved them," she whispered. "No, Ami," Yusuf replied. "You saved me. I just passed it on." That night, Zainab prayed longer than usual. Not for herself, not even for Yusuf, but for the children still waiting in silence. And for the day every woman would stop being forced to endure and start choosing to live. Years had softened Yusuf's face, but sharpened his spirit. Now in his early 40s, he stood in the garden of a small home on the edge of Lahore, a home he had built with his own hands, brick by quiet brick. It wasn't large or fancy, but it had peace in its walls. A low white fence, bougainvillea curling around the windows, and the smell of rain lingering on the soil. Inside, a woman's laughter could be heard, warm, familiar. Her name was Aliyah. Aliyah had met Yusuf years ago in a legal seminar about children's rights. She was a social worker, fierce in her own way, kind but unafraid. Yusuf had hesitated when he first felt drawn to her. He feared his past would be too heavy for someone else to carry. But Aliyah had looked him in the eyes and said, "You don't scare me. You inspire me." And that was the beginning of their life. They now had a daughter. Her name was Noor. Noor was 6, bright-eyed, stubborn, and endlessly curious. She had inherited Yusuf's thoughtful gaze and Aliyah's fire. She asked questions like bullets. "Why are some children on the streets, Baba? Why don't girls always go to school? Why do you always come home so tired?" Yusuf never shielded her from truth, but he also never burdened her. He told her, "Because we must make the world better than we found it." Noor would nod seriously, like a soldier receiving orders. She was too young to understand the shadows her father had crawled out from, but she lived in the light he built. Zainab, now in her 70s, lived in the house next door. Yusuf had insisted. "I owe her everything," he'd said, and Aliyah never questioned it. Every evening, Zainab would sit on the porch, rosary in hand, watching Noor ride her bicycle in circles, shouting, "Dottie, look at me." And Zainab would smile, the kind of smile that only comes after decades of weeping. But peace, Yusuf had learned, wasn't a permanent state. It had to be fought for, protected. One afternoon, while driving Noor back from school, Yusuf saw something that stopped him cold. A young girl, barefoot, covered in dust, being dragged by her arm by a man into a small house at the end of the street. She looked no older than 9. Her face was flat with fear. Yusuf pulled over. He didn't speak. He just watched. And then he quietly asked Noor to wait in the car. Later that night, after Noor was asleep, Yusuf sat with Aliyah and told her everything. The memories that moment had triggered, the silence in that girl's eyes, the way it reminded him of Mina, of himself. The next morning, Yusuf made calls. Discreetly, he reached out to a former shelter contact. By the end of the week, he had launched an investigation. What they uncovered was horrifying. The girl's name was Ronnie. She was not the man's daughter. She'd been brought from a rural village as a helper, a slave in all but name. Zainab heard the news and sat quietly. Then she reached out and held Yusuf's hand. "I raised a fighter," she whispered. "Now go protect her too." The case gained traction. But this time, Yusuf didn't need to stand alone. Aliyah helped organize community pressure. Zainab spoke to local women, urging them to testify. Noor even asked her school to start a donation box for girls who don't have shoes like mine. In a matter of weeks, Ronnie was freed and the man arrested. Yusuf brought Ronnie home temporarily before the shelter found her a long-term guardian. That first night, she ate quietly, sitting across from Zainab and Noor. Then, suddenly, she looked up at Yusuf and asked, "Are you my new father?" Yusuf knelt beside her and said, "No, little one, but I will always be someone who stands by you." That night, Yusuf sat alone in the porch's dim light, the same porch where Zainab once waited for the future to arrive. He thought of the boy he had been, silent, bruised, afraid. He thought of the courtrooms, the battles, the victories. But most of all, he thought of his mother, forced into a nightmare and yet, somehow, able to raise a man capable of breaking the cycle. When Zainab joined him, she said only one thing: "You built the home I always dreamed of." Yusuf looked toward the house, where Aliyah was putting Noor to bed, and smiled. "No, Ami," he whispered. "You built it, long before I ever picked up a brick." The morning was unusually still. In the soft golden light spilling through the windows of the home, she helped build with silence and sacrifice. Zainab took her last breath. She passed in her sleep, her face peaceful, her fingers resting on her prayer beads. No struggle, no sound. After years of pain, fear, strength, and purpose, her soul had quietly returned to the one she whispered to every night. Yusuf found her just before far. He knew immediately. There was a stillness in the room that felt final. No panic, no cries, just tears that welled up silently and spilled over his cheeks as he knelt beside her. "Ami," he whispered, "you can rest now." The funeral was simple, just as Zainab had wanted. She had no interest in large gatherings or mourners repeating praises they never said while she lived. What mattered was that Yusuf held her janazah with trembling hands. Noor clutched her father's side, confused but sensing the gravity. Aliyah stood quietly, holding back her own tears, knowing what Zainab had meant not just to Yusuf, but to her. But something unexpected happened after the burial. Women from every corner of the community began arriving at the house. Some came with children, some alone, some veiled in black, others weathered with age. They came to pay respects, not to the mother of a famous lawyer, but to Zainab, a woman who had once stitched their clothes, wiped their tears, given them shelter, or taught their daughters how to read. Over the years, without ceremony or pride, Zainab had become a pillar in the lives of broken women who had nowhere to go. "She gave me food when my husband threw me out," one woman said. "She told me I wasn't dirty after I escaped," another whispered. "She made me believe I could leave," a third cried. By evening, dozens of women gathered in the courtyard. Yusuf stood at the door, speechless. He thought he knew how big her heart had been. He had no idea. That night, Yusuf sat alone, his mother's scarf folded gently in his lap. Grief pressed against his chest like a weight, but with it came something else, a fire. The world needed to know who she was. Not just her story, but the thousands like hers, buried in silence. Forgotten mothers, innocent children. The system still failed them every day. And Yusuf knew his next fight wouldn't be in a single courtroom. It would be national. He took a short leave from his practice and began work on a proposal, the Zainab Protection Bill, a comprehensive women and children rights law aimed at providing legal shelter, psychological support, emergency housing, and fast-track trials for victims of domestic abuse and forced marriages. It was ambitious. It would face resistance. But Yusuf was ready. He spent a year drafting it with legal scholars, activists, and survivors. He gave speeches in universities, stood before TV cameras with trembling hands but a steady voice, and met with lawmakers who scoffed at the emotion in his mission. Still, he pressed on. Whenever he faltered, he looked at Noor and remembered the stories his mother told him under candlelight, of dreams broken, but never lost. Social media caught on. The campaign hashtag Her Name Was Zainab began trending. Survivors across the country started sharing their stories. Donations flooded in. Celebrities spoke up. Politicians began to listen, not because they wanted to, but because the people were demanding it. And one cold winter morning, Yusuf stood in the National Assembly chamber, holding a framed photo of his mother, her eyes proud, her smile soft, her scarf neatly pinned. "My mother was a statistic you never saw," he said, "but she gave this country a son who will not stop until no woman has to suffer in silence again." When the vote passed, Yusuf didn't celebrate. He simply walked outside into the wind, raised his head toward the sky, and whispered, "You did it, Ami." Later that day, at the same grave he visited every Friday, he placed the bill, now signed into law, at the foot of her resting place. Noor stood beside him, holding his hand. "Was she scared, Baba?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but she never stopped walking through that fear." "Will I be like her one day?" Noor asked. Yusuf smiled, tears warming his cheeks. "You already are."